Hey, welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. In America today, unchecked federal judges are out of control. And in the process, they're damaging the democratic process. One judge, just one, can set policy for the entire nation. This is unconstitutional. It's wrong. I talked about it yesterday, and we've got experts to say we agree with what you're saying. We've got to control it. Wendy.
Yeah, Pat, it's an unfortunate trend of the political scene in America, and it's one never envisioned by our founders. If a group loses the fight at the ballot box, they can just go to the courts. Paul Strand explains.
For more than 150 years, only the U.S. Supreme Court made judicial rulings that could affect the whole country. Now these decisions with nationwide impact are coming more frequently from single judges or local federal courts.
And voila, the whole country has to follow this one judge, this one person in this one district. It's outrageous.
This is absolutely a recent phenomenon. For the first 150 years of our nation's judicial history, this was unheard of. It simply wasn't even considered a possibility.
National Affairs reporter John Fund told CBN News judges don't have this legal authority.
The principle seems to be, I'll grab the power, and if no one stops me, I'll keep using it.
There's simply no authority underlying it.
The Heritage Foundation's Amy Swearer says such judges are moving outside the law.
It seems to be completely inconsistent with the scope of the judicial power given to the federal courts through the Constitution.
But it's gotten so bad, I think we really have to step forward and say, time out.
These judges or courts have ruled against the Trump administration almost 24 times.
23, and you know, it's early this morning, so there might be another one coming along that I haven't heard about.
The latest situation involves the separation of children from their immigrant parents seeking asylum at the border. One judge not only ordered the Trump administration to reunite them, he's now ruled the nation can't deport those reunited families.
The judge out west said, no, you can't do that.
Swearer says opponents of President Trump's policies actually look for judges who'll see things their way.
It induces this forum shopping to try to find the right judge because, as you hinted at, all it takes is one judge who disagrees with what could be hundreds of other judges.
The Supreme Court can eventually overrule these judges, but it takes time for their rulings to make it to the High Court.
Oh, about 18 months, 2 years, if you're lucky.
Swearer points out these matters that can affect national life should be decided by the people.
It's not up for the individual courts and judges to decide, well, this is good policy, so therefore it must be constitutional. It's up to the people by and through their representatives.
The Supreme Court may be looking in the future for a case or may be looking for an opportunity to rule this has gone too far.
There you have it. Either the Supreme Court can rule on a case that would stop these individuals from speaking for the whole nation, or Congress can take action. A true balance of power as envisioned by our founders. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from outside U.S. District Court, Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Paul. I've been talking about this a number of times, and I'll say it again. The Constitution is clear. It established one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress will, from time to time, designate. They are to set their powers, their jurisdiction, and all that. But unfortunately, we've got Congress that probably enough Democrats to just love this thing. But the idea that somebody in Hawaii, in a little federal district court in Hawaii, is going to dictate to the entire nation how it's going to behave, this is outrageous. It is totally contrary to the Constitution. And Justice Thomas, for example, said it's unconstitutional. But what does it do? It leads to nothing but chaos, because these rulings will come. How do they shouldn't go from the district court to the Supreme Court, because the issues aren't clearly delineated. The participants aren't clearly established. The law is not clearly set up. And what's normally the case is the Supreme Court grants certiorari when there's a conflict of the circuit. So one circuit court, not a district court, but a circuit court, having heard an appeal from a district court, makes a ruling. Another circuit listens to the similar thing, but it's come up from a district court, and they make a ruling, and these rulings conflict. At that point, there's a clash of the circuits, and the Supreme Court will grant cert, and they'll decide between the circuits. But the idea of the Supreme Court having to take a case directly from a district court is outrageous. It just is wrong. And I would say, number one, Trump has the power, if he's so, no, he doesn't have the power, but the Congress has the power to say, look, two things. The district court judge does not have any authority beyond the area in which his district is located. That's geographic. And the second thing, that he does not have power to rule on anybody who is not a litigant before him in a case where both sides have representation. But the idea of an ex parte ruling, as they call it, that just reaches out across the nation and says, well, the Trump administration must do this, that, and the other. Well, I think, you know, you're not in contempt of court if you just ignore it, because he's the president, and he can say, I will not accept that kind of a ruling, and I won't take it. But nevertheless, that might hurry the case. But to have these things go to the Supreme Court until they're, you use the term ripe, there's something really terribly wrong. And it's arrogance. The thing we need with judges is humility, judicial humility, not arrogance. Well, Democrats, if you can talk about an arrogance, they now want to subpoena the translator who was in the one-on-one meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And this, of course, is executive privilege and is a violation of the constitutional prerogative of the president to set foreign policy. But nobody seems to want to listen to the Constitution anymore. They just want to do what they want to do. Well, John Jessup has more on that.
Well, Pat, Democrats say they want to know exactly what President Trump and Vladimir Putin agreed to behind closed doors. The two-hour meeting wrapped up just minutes before the press conference that's created an uproar in Congress and the media.
We need to have the president share with us what happened at that meeting. If he won't do it, then the interpreter should come, and we should make sure that we know what happened.
Others are more direct, saying Congress should subpoena the translator to testify. As Pat was saying, translators are bound by a code of ethics not to share privileged information. Lawmakers, though, say they're looking into the precedent of calling translators to testify. The president's team has not released details of the conversation between the two leaders. Republicans Bob Corker and Lindsey Graham want Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to brief the Senate Intelligence Committee on the meetings next week. Well, despite efforts to cut back on wasteful federal spending, a new report shows the pigs are still at the trough. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson shows us some of this year's biggest projects charged to the American taxpayer.
Republicans are supposedly the party of fiscal responsibility, yet the 2018 Congressional Pig Book shows that earmarks in pork barrel spending are dangerously on the rise and costing taxpayers billions.
The cost of earmarks doubled in fiscal year 2018 from $6.8 billion to $14.7 billion.
Americans thought the practice of lawmakers using federal funds for pet projects back home, like the infamous $398 million Alaska Bridge to Nowhere, ended in 2011.
They're simply less transparent and more secretive. Rather than listing the names of the members of Congress, they just add a huge amount of money and then divide it up, probably behind closed doors, calling the agencies.
This year's summary exposed things like $65 million for the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund and $13 million going to local museums, opera houses, and theaters.
It is very frustrating. We need to do better for our taxpayers.
Congressman Mark Walker says this practice leads to shady favors, a corrupt government, and wasteful spending.
I find it, and I believe a lot of the people that I talk to in North Carolina, one of the most frustrating things is using the taxpayers' dollars to arrange deals or get things to vote one way or the other. That's what we've got to continue to improve on here in D.C.
Some lawmakers want to lift the earmark ban to ease the gridlock of spending bills. But Senator Jeff Flake calls that a terrible idea.
This notion that if you have a bunch of earmarks, you can speed the appropriations process just doesn't wash. All it does is leverage more spending. It is the gateway drug to spending addiction.
These lawmakers argue earmarks are the antithesis of draining the swamp, and they're fighting to see them banned once and for all. Reporting from Washington, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Thanks, Abby. Pat, so much for draining the swamp.
Yeah, well, I've got one that, I asked their producer, give me some horribles. Well, how about this? In Guam, there's what they call the brown snake. We don't have any of those in America. but they're in Guam, and they want to spend $865,000 to eradicate the brown snake in Guam, because they said they were introduced there by our soldiers in World War II. I mean, that's just one of the things. And you go down the list, you know, plant eradication, swamp grass, and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's just crazy.
That poor brown snake. It
brown
probably...
snakes in Guam. We don't, brown tree snake, they want to eradicate that rascal because our servicemen introduced them during World War II. But, I mean, it's just, you know, incredible what they do, and it's out of control. Somebody wants to spend some money, and they'll do it, you know. They had one for Lawrence Welk's birthplace. They wanted to build a monument to, because I like Lawrence Welk. I think he was a nice guy, but you're going to spend $400,000 to build a monument for him.
Not with my taxpayer money.
Well, it's like they're not spending your money, they're spending, well, it's the government's money, so everybody wants a little piece of the action. Well, I want to salute Nikki Haley. She is absolutely brilliant. And she is our ambassador to the UN, and John has a story about what she said.
That's right, Pat. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley expanded on the decision to withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council. Haley told a standing room audience at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington that the Trump administration withdrew Tuesday because of the council's bias against Israel and its willingness to allow notorious human rights abusers as members.
The Human Rights Council is the United Nations' greatest failure. It has taken the idea of human dignity, the idea that's at the center of our national creed and the birthright of every human being, and it has reduced it to just another instrument of international politics.
Haley cited the admission of Congo as a member even as mass graves were being discovered there. She also spoke about the failure to address human rights abuses in countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, adding that the United States will continue to fight for human rights in the future, just not from the Council. Well, a Turkish court has sent an American pastor accused of spying back to prison. Andrew Brunson's family, friends, and even the president had hoped he'd be released, but their expectations were dashed after a Wednesday hearing. Gary Lane brings us the details.
It was the third hearing for the 50-year-old North Carolina pastor, and it ended in another disappointment. That's because many people thought Andrew Brunson would be freed from prison. He has spent 20 months behind Turkish bars on accusations that he spied on the government and plotted with rebels to overthrow President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in July 2016. For nearly 2 hours during the hearing, former church members testified against Pastor Brunson, making vague, unsubstantiated accusations. When the judge asked Brunson to reply to the witnesses, he said, quote, "My faith teaches me to forgive, so I forgive those who testified against me." Only one witness from the defense was allowed to testify. The U.S. government expressed concern about the court's decision.
I have read the indictment. I have attended 3 hearings. I don't believe that there is any indication that Pastor Brunson is guilty of any sort of criminal or terrorist activity.
The Trump administration and members of Congress have been pressuring Turkey to release the pastor. On Wednesday, President Trump expressed displeasure, tweeting, "A total disgrace that Turkey will not release respected U.S. pastor Andrew Brunson from prison. He's been held hostage far too long. Erdogan should do something to free this wonderful Christian husband and father. He has done nothing wrong, and his family needs him." Cece Heil of the American Center for Law and Justice says, immediately after the court decision, the Trump administration and members of Congress began working again diplomatically to help free Brunson.
It's a devastating blow, so I would just, pray for encouragement for Pastor Brunson and for his family, because they suffer the same.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Thanks, Gary. Pat, Pastor Brunson now languishing in a Turkish prison for 2 years.
You know, this Erdogan is really a thug. We used to consider that Turkey was our strong ally. And when there was an overthrow of the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire and so forth, Turkey became a secular democracy and has been a valued member of NATO and other alliances. They were with us in Korea, for example, and other places. and their fighting men are exemplary. But Erdogan has decided he doesn't want a secular democracy anymore. He wants a Muslim dictatorship with himself the dictator. He wants to be another sultan or whatever they call themselves. And they no longer should be a part of NATO. They should no longer be a part of the Western alliance against anybody, because they're enemies of Israel, they're enemies of freedom, and they're now the enemy of Christianity. And he spoke about the clash between the mosque and the cross. And that clash is coming. But to arrest a man like Pastor Brunson, you know, up to this point, Turkey has been free. And if you go back and look at the Bible, you know, when John writes about the churches of Asia, you know, those Thyatira and all those churches, they're all in Turkey. That's all encompassed by what we now know as Turkey. And it's a very important country, but for a time it was known as the sick man of Europe because they had so many problems. But what we want to see now is I don't know what to do, but we certainly, we can't give them any support anymore. But we have a big military airfield at Incirlik in Turkey, and they can control the way we fly. And they were trying to do that during the Gulf War, is to tell our people we couldn't fly in a certain area because they were coming out of an airfield in their country. I think it's time we redeploy that and get out of Turkey and begin to bring the sanctions against them that we have applied against other dictators. Well, so much for that.